I think we're going to begin the next session, so settle down and all right. Well, thanks so much for being here. This is a very exciting event for me personally. Looking back at the 25-year history of Bioneers, all these people, individuals you see sitting here, have had a very important role in the evolution of this community. And I'm going to not spend a long time introducing Paul and Jeffrey, because I believe, how many of you were here this morning? All of you, right? So, okay, so we're not going to rehash. I just want to quickly say that the one person who hasn't been introduced on this main stage is someone who has graced this main stage many times in the past, is Katsi Cook, who is a pioneer in reintroducing Aboriginal midwifery practices, and also a heroic environmental researcher up in her part of the world in northern New York State and Ontario, in the Iroquois lands. And I remember a slogan I heard long ago from Iroquois people, that if you want to get something done, ask a Mohawk. And so we have a Mohawk here who's gotten a whole lot done in her lifetime. And Katsi participated a lot in the early years of Bioneers and in the middle years on panels on herbalism and green medicine. And she's also one of the most beautiful singers that I've ever heard, but I don't know if that's going to be part of the program today. But in any case, I've never forgotten her singing. Anyway, and to her immediate right, I guess, is Paul Stamets, who you all know, the, how can I say this, the superstar of biomimicry and mycology, one of the people that we love the most deeply, and a real fun guy. So, you know, it's that Jewish New York thing, you have to throw the bad joke in there, so stuff. And then you all heard from Jeffrey Bronfman this morning, and he's someone who's really integral in the earliest launch of Bioneers, and who's really been a deep, deep ally from the very, very beginning. And so this is a real historical reunion for us. And of course, we're going to be exploring the use of sacred plants, which is something that can be controversial, but in this community, I think, is not probably really a controversial topic, but nonetheless a really fascinating one. So I think that what we are especially interested in focusing on today is not only, the effects of these plants, what they are, but we're going to especially focus on how the wisdom and the visionary states and the other things that come through the teachings of these plant teachers, how they can be translated into action in the world. But before we do that, I do want to begin by asking each of our presenters here how they first encountered a sacred plant, what their experiences were, and just briefly so we know where they're coming from before we get into that second theme. And I know, we'll start with you, Katsi, that for you, it's not native to the use of these powerful, however you want to call them, but mind-altering plants are not part of your culture, but that it came through tribal family relationships, through your relationships with Mayan people and with people in the southwest of in Lakota and other relatives of yours. I'll let you start with perhaps your first encounter and experience with sacred plants.
Thank you, JP, and thank you, Jeffrey and Paul. My name is Katsi Jakwa. I'm a Mohawk from Akwesasne Mohawk Nation on the US-Canadian border, Quebec, Ontario, and New York State. In my journey to becoming a traditional Mohawk midwife, I left a training program at the University of New Mexico, having left my community, asking my clan mothers, how do we teach the young about birth? And they said, we forgot all that. So I set out on a journey across the US and ended up with my mother-in-law, Beatrice Holy Dance Long Visitor, one of the 13 indigenous grandmothers, who delivered many babies in her community. And I asked, how is this done? And she said, daughter-in-law, if you want to know that, you have to go in that teepee. And I said, are our Longhouse people teach not to use any mind changers. And she said, daughter-in-law, I don't think you know what this medicine is. It's a spirit. And some have seen him. He has long white hair down to his knees, and you make a relationship with him. And so I sat in there with my sister-in-law and through the night and realized by midnight water that I was in labor. I was in a birth, that I was on a journey to learn midwifery, to handle the lives of 2 human beings, and this medicine became my teacher. And in fact, the fireplace of the Teepee Society, where I live, is our university. That's where we know what we know about the process of becoming and giving birth, and how our ancestors play a role in all of that. And in the interest of time, I would say that in fact, the word hallucinogen is one of those science words that really is not in our consciousness as Mohawk people. And in fact, the sacred medicine, Onukwat Goa, Pejutawakan, Peyote, belongs to a family of medicine, that the focus of the ceremony is not even the peyote, it's the tobacco that came to this world in the hands of a pregnant woman who fell from a hole in the sky world and brought from a sacred tree gifts of seeds and sacred things. And among those things were the Oyunkwaunwe, the old ancient one, our Indian tobacco, which is also classified as a hallucinogen. When you burn that tobacco in the sacred fire with your thoughts, your words, your intentions, that smoke, they call it, that goes back to that hole in the sky world to carry your words to the sky beings. The words for that process is called Gayangalit Gwitskoa, and it means it hits and it opens. And so that's what the sacramental use of our Oyunkwaunwe, our Indian tobacco, is really about. It's not about this. And the other hallucinogen is our Ononorno, which is the small sweet flag that grows all over the world in marshy areas. And since I was a little girl, my grandmother, when we were sick in the fall, maybe a chest, anything in the head and the chest, Calamus ecorus. And I didn't know that until a colleague of mine who was the dean of a school of public health was quarantined for animal or human forms of TB. And he called me from his home describing his illness, and so I sent in the mail to him some ononoru and instructed him how to use it. That you break off a knuckle of it, you stick it in your cheek, and you make a relation with it. Ask it to help you, and hold it in there, and it'll swell with all those poisons that are making you ill. And he did that for a week, and he called me and said, "What is that stuff you gave me?" He said, "Not only did I stop coughing up blood, but my mood improved." And I was curious about that, so I looked at James Duke's database at the USDA, the Department of Agriculture, and sure enough, he had characterized the molecular contents of this medicine, and it said beta-acerone is responsible for the mildly hallucinogenic quality of this plant. A plant that my grandmother would send me and my sister when we went away to a Catholic boarding school off the reservation. And so I had no idea. So JP, we do have hallucinogenic plants, but this plant we call it Ononoru Goa, the big medicine for anything to help you. And so with that, I'll pass it.
Well, I grew up in a small town in Ohio near Youngstown called Columbiana. It was a dry town, very conservative. I was dragged to charismatic Christian revival tents a lot when I was around 14 or 15. And some of you heard about my brother John passing, and he was my mentor. And John went to Yale, and he was, and when he came back from Yale, he brought back a book when I was 15 years of age, and it was called Altered States of Consciousness by Charles Tart in 1970. And my best friend, Ryan Snyder, who I grew up with him, and we hung out together all the time. And I was just mesmerized by my brother John's experiences in Mexico and Colombia, eating magic mushrooms, and I was a younger brother, all too eager to emulate my older brother. And he lent me this book. And so I had this book, Altered States of Consciousness, and I'm sharing it with my friend Ryan Snyder. And Ryan goes, well, I want to borrow this book. And I said, sure, Ryan, but give it back to me in a week, So that was okay. So a week passes, and I go, Ryan, it's been a week, give me back my book. And he kind of hemmed and hawed and wouldn't return the book. And so I waited a while longer, and I kept on asking him, and he kept on avoiding the question. And finally, I said, I want that book back. I'll come down to your house and get it. He goes, I'm sorry, Paul, I can't give it back to you. And I said, why? He said, my father found it and burned it. I said, your father burned my book? It was given to me by my brother in trust. I'm in the middle of this. And and it really upset me. But then I began to think, wow, the information in that book was so powerful. It made somebody burn the book because they had the fear of this knowledge. So I thought, wow, this is the forbidden fruit. And and these charismatic Christians are just really not in the same realm that I want to be in, right? So my brother John, this realm was much more interesting to me. So this really influenced me in a huge way. I never got the book back, by the way. And Ryan Snyder's father was convinced, I was from Satan and corrupting his son. Anyhow, so I didn't have a magic mushroom experience until I went to Kenyon College in Ohio when I was around 19 years of age. And I was really eager to get some magic mushrooms, so I bought some, and I got a bag of mushrooms for like $20, and I thought, okay, it's reasonable. But nobody else would, I didn't know who else to eat them with. So late in the spring, early summer, I decided set and setting is important. I read about that. Andrew Weil had a chapter in the book and a whole bunch of other people. And so I just thought, I'll walk about 2 miles to this really, really beautiful rolling green hill countryside with these beautiful oak trees. And so I thought, okay, I might as well eat the mushrooms. And I thought the bag was like 1 dose, So, I figured, okay, they said about half an hour before it can come on. It's about halfway through the walk, I started eating the mushrooms. And then I'm eating the mushrooms, and I'm in love with climbing trees ever since I was a kid, and there's this huge oak tree on the very top of this hill. So I'm eating the mushrooms, I see this oak tree, it's just perfect for climbing. And a storm was coming. I could hear thunder and lightning on the horizon. So the tree is the very top of the highest hill, and I thought it would be a great viewscape. So I consumed the entire bag of mushrooms, and I climbed to the top of the tree, so I have a really good visual. And then this visual was, those of you in the Midwest in the summer, with this boiling black clouds with lightning strikes, And then I started having, suddenly the air became a liquid. I went, whoa, this is what I read about, look at this, And then the storm front's coming at me, and then fractal patterns, waves. Wow, whoa, this is really interesting, But the experience didn't slow down. It kept on getting more and more intense. And I'm at the top of this tree, and I started getting vertigo. And the storm and the lightning is coming, and this frontal hot wind precedes the clouds, before the rain comes. And then I realized, oh my gosh, I'm getting vertigo. I am in the most dangerous place that you can be, doing a lightning storm at the top of this hill. And so I held on to the tree for sustenance, because it anchored me. And then holding on to the tree, I went through the tree into the roots and had this feeling that you spoke so eloquently of oneness with the planet. And what you have not mentioned is I had a congenital stuttering habit. I went through 6 years of speech therapy. I stuttered all my life like this. And I couldn't speak. Now, the stutterers like myself, we can speak without stuttering to animals. And we can sing. But we come to people, we can't speak without stuttering. So I went through 6 years of speech therapy. In the 3rd and 4th grade, they pulled a meeting with the school officials to put me in special education. It was that severe. My family was very, very concerned. But I scored really high on all my tests. So they realized that my speech impediment was not because I wasn't smart, it's just this societal thing. So I'm up in this tree, and the winds and the waves and the lightning, and I'm just like closing my eyes, and I open up, and the intensity was so much. But I thought, this is where I'm going to die. This is a good place to die. I'm rooted literally to the earth. And then I'm up there for hours, and I thought my biggest issue is I can't speak. I have the hardest time. And so I couldn't date ladies because they wanted to be with the macho, self-assured, male personalities, and I was a person who didn't have those attributes. So I wouldn't stare people in the eyes. I'd always avert my gaze and look on the ground. That's why I found mushrooms. So I'm tripping my brains out on my first trip and saying that nothing that I read even comes close to this. And then I said to myself, what is my biggest issue in life? And I said, stuttering. And so I said to myself, stop stuttering now. Stop stuttering now. That was my mantra. And I said it hundreds, maybe thousands of times. At that edge and the precipitous of being electrocuted from a lightning strike, from overdosing from mushrooms, but the tree was so important to me. It literally rooted me to the earth. And the storm passed. Fortunately, I did not get hit by lightning. I came down off the tree and literally came down as I walked back. And I went to my room and I went to bed. And then I woke up the next morning. And I didn't see anybody. And there's this one lady that really liked me. I think she was maybe sympathy love or generosity. I'm not sure what it was. But I came out of my room and I'm walking down the sidewalk, and then here she comes. I go, oh no. And I always hi, and look down on the ground, didn't want to say anything else but one syllable, because I could usually get that out. And she came up to me and she said, good morning, Paul. And for the first time, I looked at her straight in the eyes, and she asked me, how are you doing today? And I said, I'm doing great. And I stopped stuttering in one day. Now, a short caveat, I still do stutter. Like when I met Bill Gates and Al Gore, I'm starstruck, so I will stutter. If someone throws a microphone in front of me and I've been drinking, smoking some herb, and they ask me, how do you grow mushrooms? I'm going, like filling a well with a teaspoon. Where do I start? So there are times that I do get when I get nervous and whatnot, but I would say it's 99% cured from one psilocybin experience. And I think I basically, from a physiological, neurological point of view, I was able to reestablish a different neural network. And I've been told by some scientists who study this that with some type of stutterers in the 6th to 7th month in the womb, when my mother was pregnant, a nerve did not develop properly. And so us stutterers, what oftentimes happens is that we'll try to change a word up really fast, and we'll try to trick our brain. So if you see a stutterer and they pause, they're actually trying to get away from the word that's hanging them up, and they try to find an alternative word to go around it. Or they're trying to change the subject in their mind, because stutterers tend to be really high intelligence, and oftentimes their thought stream is several sentences further ahead than their mouth is speaking. So that's what really told me that mushrooms were my sacrament. They were the crack in my cosmic egg that really made a huge difference to me. And I just want to add one little short event. So my wife Dusty knows this story and she loves it. And so we went to Crater Lake Lodge in Oregon, and we're at the lodge and we're having lunch. And this busboy comes up, and he's about 16 years of age, or 17, and he goes, don't interrupt a stutterer. Just smile, be at peace with it. And he finally goes, can I help you? I went, wow, that's exactly the way I stuttered. And so I told him, I stuttered exactly like you. Now this I could tell from the cultural imprint of who this young man was, that he came from a very conservative, probably Christian family, just like I did. And I said, I used to stutter just like you. And he goes, this is actually getting real for me. You did? And I go, yeah. And I was able to cure it in one day. And he goes, well, what did you do? So I told him this whole story. His eyes got really wide. My wife was like ready to have a heart attack. I was like, oh my God. And he walked away, but I felt like, yeah, that was right on,
I just wanted to add one note, which is that from the Bioneers perspective, it should be Al Gore and Bill Gates who would be stuttering and nervous in the presence of Paul Stamets.
I have a phenomenon that happens with me. I'll be traveling, sitting on a plane, and someone will come up to me and go, what do you do? And I remember for years I've been working on different ways of answering that question, and so trying to find a way to tell this part of my story is not necessarily going to be that easy, because there's a lot of steps that brought me to the moment where I had my first encounter with the sacramental use, of a plant. And I was actually introduced by a non-Indian friend to a group of Native American people who he had been in Taos, New Mexico. He had left Taos and moved to Austin, Texas, where I was living at the time, and he was leading sweat lodge ceremonies that he had learned there. And between rounds in the sweat lodge ceremony, he started speaking about some experiences that he had had, just very casually, not in any way to elicit any kind of response from anybody, but I picked up on it, and he described that it was experiences with the sacred medicine peyote within the Native American church. And so I asked him, I said, if there's ever an opportunity to have this experience, I'd like to know more about it. And at that time in my life, it was a new thing to consider reopening the door in what, Gaji referred to as hallucinogens, which I had thought I had had some experience with, and I decided that it wasn't for me. But there was levels through years of meditation practice that I had had up until that point. I kind of believed in the prevailing philosophy of that time that I think was articulated well by Ram Dass, which is once you get the message, hang up the phone, and just once you get the message that the spirit world exists, no longer, use any kind of psychoactive, aids, go and pursue meditation, a life of discipline, a life of practice, and then you could reach these states of consciousness without, this. And I'd done that faithfully for 20 years, and this guy was talking outside the sweat lodge about something that I had not even come close to experiencing in my meditation practice, and I wanted to. So I had my first experience of the use of peyote within a sacramental context in Texas. There's a very thin band of close to Laredo, Texas, where the peyote medicine grows. And every year at around President's Day, there's groups of people from the Native American church who come there to harvest the peyote and take it back to their communities. And I was invited to come and participate in the ceremony. And anybody who has the idea that the sacred use in a ritual setting of these very serious plants of power, plants of knowledge, sacred plants, is in any way similar to some kind of recreational use of drug, has not ever entered into a state where you've encountered the reality of what these ceremonies are and how they work. And I had the privilege of being in a ceremony that lasted, I think we entered into the teepee at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. We didn't leave the teepee until 9 or 10 o'clock the next morning, maybe 11 o'clock the next morning. And we were there in in prayer all night long. And through the course of the night, there were teachings that started to be given, and I witnessed the elders bringing orientations to this young man who had left the tribe. This was a tribe from Oklahoma, which was where the medicine was first legally incorporated in its use in the United States in the late 1800s. And he had left the tribe. He was living with kind of a community of young people outside of Phoenix, and was doing a lot of different drugs and things. And he was back in front of the sacred fire and back in front of his ancestors and his elders. And he was being taught and needing to correct his mistakes. And this was the first time I saw people with experience of wisdom, elders, using the opportunity in a state of transcendent consciousness to orient and ethics and give orientations about ethics and how to conduct one's life that are fundamental to the use of these sacraments within a spiritual context, within a religious context. And so that next morning, there was an old man by the name of Tell Us Good Morning. That was his name, medicine man from Taos Pueblo. And he's since passed. He was in his 90s at that time, and he comes up to me to shake my hand and wish me good morning, because that's what he did, was, say good morning to people. And he said to me, he looked at me in the eyes and he said, today you've become a peyote man. And from this day forward, other peyote men are going to recognize you and know that you're on this medicine path. And what happened to me was, less than 2 weeks later, I was introduced to a man through a mystic set of circumstances who had been working with the sacred medicine of peyote for several decades, with elders from different tribes in Mexico, from the Huichol, from the Tarahumara, from the Tepoano, different tribes in Mexico that used the sacred medicine. And he was organizing a movement this was in 1988, 89. And he was planning for what was going to be the 500th anniversary of Columbus's so-called discovery of America, which was very articulately expressed from the stage today, the beginning of an invasion and the beginning of the imposition of one set of values that held the world and held nature and held our place in nature in a very different cosmology and understanding of the world than the native people who were here in this hemisphere, who had evolved systems of law, had evolved systems of mathematics, had evolved systems of agriculture, had evolved systems, social systems that had served them for centuries. And at the time, that wasn't recognized. And so so he invited me to come down to Mexico, where I apprenticed for a number of years with different peyote medicine people from different tribes, and through this teacher was able to go and travel with him to different native tribes throughout Central and South America, and became introduced to different plant medicines, and became aware of the fact that all throughout Aboriginal cultures, First Peoples, First Nations cultures throughout the Americas, there were sacred plants that were psychoactive, that were part of the original instructions and part of the responsibility of how to live and how to conduct oneself on the earth. And that was when I became aware of the use of plants within the Amazon. And I made my first trip down to the Amazon in July of 1990 at another invitation, after attending a gathering of indigenous people throughout the hemisphere that were looking to organize a movement in response to this 500th anniversary celebration that was being planned by the Spanish and the Italians, that they were going to spend billions on what was essentially a celebration of a conquest and the destruction of native cultures. And as a result of a movement that we were able to initiate at that time, we were able to turn that around. And so 1992 became a focal point for the re-education of people about the value of the cultures of the Americas that preceded the arrival of the Europeans. And it was a very significant and important social movement. And in the organization that happened at that time, I was, I'll make this brief, but it's good kind of historical background, because what I hope for this conversation today, knowing Gaji and knowing Paul personally, and as people whose whole life and work has been informed by their connection to these sacred plants, to these sacred medicines, to have a conversation not about their use, but how to utilize the information that comes through these sacred plants in order to bring about benefit to the world. Because I feel that that's the real art of working with the sacred science, of how to use the information that comes spiritually to us through the use of these plants and then apply it in a way that brings about changes in the world. So the next significant moment in this story was I met, as I mentioned today, a man by the name of Reuben Snake, who fulfilled the prophecy that Tell Us Good Morning had said to me. And he got up in a gathering of indigenous leaders, and that I had been invited as a representative of a foundation that was looking to initiate this social work. He got up and spoke, and I could tell that he was a peyote man from the way that he spoke. There was a certain way that he addressed, and certain acknowledgments, and certain things that said, oh, this guy, knows peyote. So I came up to him and I said, I think I know some relatives of yours. And he looked at me very suspiciously. He said, oh, yeah, who? And I gave him some names, and he embraced me then as a friend. He said, well, we're having a peyote meeting at my house tonight. You guys and your friends are welcome to come. So that was how I met Reuben Snake, which was on April 20th, 1990. And interestingly, that night was the night that the Supreme Court published its opinion that the use of peyote wasn't protected under the Constitution of the United States, and the use of sacred plants was not protected under the Bill of Rights. And that night in the ceremony, we didn't know that this was going to happen. Reuben embraced me as his brother in front of his family, and his tribe declared that that I was his brother, and did a little ritual that night, and then we woke up then we got up the next morning to find out that this had happened with the Supreme Court. And in the first TP meeting that I went to, I encountered a quality of true religious expression that I'd not experienced in my life before then. And what I experienced was the years growing up in the temples where we were taught, as the Jewish people shortly after the Holocaust, never again. That was the chant that was there within the temples. Never again to allow a culture and a way of life to be threatened with extermination on this earth. And I took that very much to heart. And that night in that teepee, I saw these very simple, humble people whose way of life was threatened. And I made a vow, if there's ever anything that I could do to help this, I make that commitment. And so when I was there with Reuben Snake, and we found out that the Supreme Court had ruled that the Constitution and the Bill of Rights did not protect the use of sacred plants by Native people whose cultures had existed far longer than the Constitution, I said to him, we're going to change this. And he said to me, yes, my brother, we will. And so we started to work on organizing a response through connections that Reuben had in Congress to bring about a change in the law. A change in the law that opened up was called the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. And what this act served to do was acknowledge that primary to the ethic of the social experiment that is the United States is the guarantee of the free exercise of religion. And to redefine the law about what that meant when the Supreme Court had interpreted it to mean something very restrictive. And I'm only mentioning this as an example because the next 14 years of my life were spent in the process of using the information that would come to me through these sacred plants to first work with the people who could write the law, get the law passed, get the law signed into law, get another church that I encountered in Brazil using a different sacred plant registered within the United States, and then a process that led me, as Kenny was describing today, to go through the process of arriving to the Supreme Court and getting the Supreme Court to accept the correction of a law that I had played a part in having passed, restoring religious liberty, restoring religious freedom. So the relevant detail that I want to share here is the instructions that allowed me to follow the path, to have the success of making the contribution that I and others were able to make was 100% guided every step of the way by the information that was coming to us through the ceremonies and the instructions that we were following through our practice. So that's how I came to this.
I just want to mention quickly that the story of the whole case and going through the Supreme Court is in a book that Bioneers published called Visionary Plant Consciousness that also includes a great chapter from Guji and several participations by Paul, because it's a collection based on a lot of talks and plenary addresses that were given here at Bioneers. So if you can get a hold of that book, I recommend it highly. But anyway, I wanted, before we get into more about what you were discussing of how the messages or the wisdom that comes through these plants is expressed in your lives, just a little bit more about the form that information comes to you. I mean, I know this is something ineffable and hard to discuss, but and if you're not comfortable discussing it, then we'll go somewhere else. But in what form does it, for some people it may come orally or visually or in a deeper sense of knowing. So just if you could touch upon that of how that information is transmitted to you.
When you enter through a threshold, you're entering in a different consciousness, a different space, and that space is boundaried by certain elements that are part of the ceremony as practiced in my own community. And so the first time I sat with the medicine and the ancient Native American Church of South Dakota, I followed my sister-in-law's instructions to make a relationship with this medicine, sitting in a teepee of about 30 people. The roadman, the leader of the ceremony, who sat at a half moon. There's so many elements that there's not really time to describe, and I'm sure some of you, like Jeffrey, have attended these ceremonies. But we open ours with those handagaliwa tekwa, those words that come before anything else. But at that time in South Dakota, I followed my sister-in-law's instructions and prayed until about midnight water, because that's another essential element of the ceremony itself, is they'll bring water in to water the people. You're watering the people, and prayers are put into that water. And I was there at a going back to school ceremony. We were there to pray for our children who were going back to school, and I had just come from the University of New Mexico's Women's Health Training Program, having achieved the biomedical skills necessary to be a safe practitioner. But I wanted to understand more of the traditional knowledge that went with the practice of midwifery. And so after cleansing my mind and my spirit and my body, we experience this medicine will open your mind, open your body, and open your spirit. It gets your ego out of your way. And it opens you in such a way that you have access to spirit. And in that first ceremony, after cleansing my emotions and releasing experiences, griefs in my life, by about 3 in the morning after midnight water, I just felt that the prayer I had carried to South Dakota in that journey I was making was, Grandfather, how will I know what to do in this humbleness that you show me? How will I know how to take care of 2 lives? How to accept that responsibility? And I don't know what I expected, but all of a sudden in my ear, I heard the words very clearly, just do it. And this was years before the Nike commercial and the branding of the Nike Corporation. Yeah, that's my teaching, just do it. And it just shifted a gear inside of me. And since that moment, the oral, I have a problem Native American children have the highest rates of otitis media, or ear infections, in all of North America. So, something to do with twisted eustachian tubes. And so I had multiple ear infections. I grew up not being able to hear, and when they finally discovered I couldn't hear, you know, so it's interesting that the main messages that I received sitting around that fireplace is what they would call an oral hallucination, but actually all your senses are involved. Your whole being is involved. And the idea that it opens your mind and your body and your spirit is a powerful experience. And I was 23 years old when I first went in as a nursing mother. I took an infant 8 months old, nursing him through the ceremony. And I began to realize by the time the sun rose and the water woman brought in the door, the morning water, which is a representation of the feminine arriving from the spirit world into this place, I felt a lot of confidence. I understood something that is beyond words. And I'm going to be 63 in January. That's 40 years I've been walking with this medicine and using it. And so I'm the founding Aboriginal midwife of the Six Nations Birthing Center in the province of Ontario, under which we function under an exemption in the 1992 Midwifery Act and Regulated Health Professions Act for Aboriginal midwives and Aboriginal healers from any regulation by the government. And so having worked with the Interim Regulatory College of Midwives of Ontario, we professionalized the practice of midwifery in that province. But before the act was proclaimed by Parliament, I told my colleagues, we have this exemption, a doorway of our sovereignty. If we don't use our rights, we'll lose our rights. So we were able to establish a birthing center that is still delivering babies in that community and creating new midwives. We have a National Aboriginal Council of Midwives in Canada, in Ontario, and you can Google www.aboriginalmidwifery.ca. And so as an elder in that process, we went from just me in Ontario to over 50 Aboriginal midwives in Canada. And we're building. Reuben Snake and other leaders would say, everything in this teepee belongs to the women. And so that medicine has been the spirit that guides my work for all these years. And in the application of it to individual cases, such as a mother who brought her daughter to me in her last week of pregnancy. She was due for her birth in 4 days and asked, will you deliver her baby at home? And I said, this is a process that should have begun when she first thought of getting pregnant. Because that's a process of asking the ancestors for a life. And 4 days from now she's due, and who's been taking care of her? She said, well, we have this obstetrician, but for the last 6 weeks we haven't seen him. So I said, well, let's just visit, let's just talk. And as we talked, I said, how about I just check your belly? How have you been? What have you been doing? Why haven't you gone to your care provider? And it's this attitude, very attitude of, there's nothing to this, there's nothing to having a baby. Everybody has babies all the time. So I laid her down on my office floor and palpated her belly, and I had already been clued in when I said, is your baby active? She said, no, I haven't felt my baby move in 4 days. So I used 2 different Dopplers to look for a heart rate, and I couldn't find one. So I said, it might be my machine, it might be me. Let's go to my sister over in the clinic and we'll find another machine to use to find the heart rate. But I could tell already there was no baby there, the flaccidity of the abdomen. But you don't want to say right away to this young mother and her mother who presented to my practice, this baby's gone. So on the way there, I talked to her mother. Mohawk women, we do everything as a kinship network, including handling this medicine. So I took her to the clinic, and then I explained to her mother, I said, I believe, out of earshot of the woman, I believe this baby didn't survive, but be here for your daughter, and we'll go through, but the ultimate diagnosis has to be at the hospital with an ultrasound. And of course, after we went through that whole process, the baby, in fact, had passed away. And so they asked me to do the delivery in the hospital, which I was happy to do. But the grandmother who brought her daughter had visited my sister before she came to my practice. And my sister told her, well, you know, Gaji uses this sacred medicine in her work. And this is a Longhouse Bear Clan woman, and she says, are we going to see pink elephants? And my sister assured her that she wouldn't. And so as part of her care, I brought medicine with me to the hospital and ended up working with this young family and the mother and her mother. I take them in the bathroom, and I told them she was having a hard time getting the baby out. There's a lot to this story, so I'm just skipping through the framework of it. And I offered this medicine to the mother and to the father, and then to my Bear Clan friend who had made the comment about pink elephants. I said, this is a spirit that is about birth, will open you and help you. And in using that medicine, the young woman was able to relax and even take a short nap while her mother and I went off to take a little break. And when we came back, I got her going, and she was able to push her baby out on her knees. And when the baby came, of course, already the baby was going back to the earth. There's certain signs. I had prepared the young family for the signs they would see. I said, there's not going to be any muscle tone. The baby will look scalded. The skull plates will be separating. You need to be prepared for what you're going to see. And it's okay that you even hold your baby to your skin, talk to your baby, and greet your baby and say goodbye to your baby, but we need to put the baby on the cradle board as soon as possible, because these babies are literally, disassembling. And when the baby came out, a bubble came out of her mouth, and the young father said, "She's alive!" I said, "No, she's not alive," and handed the baby to the grandmother, because the mother recoiled in her pain, emotional pain. And so we put the baby on the cradle board, bathed it, the family started to show up, and we were able to take the baby back to our community and take care of that, complete it, go full cycle, because part of the ceremony, part of the knowledge that belongs to it is how you move within a certain space, how you carry that prayer. And it's really a beautiful attention that needs to be paid to every minute that's going on. Like a snowflake, like a fingerprint, like a dream. Every birth has its own interpretation. And this medicine is part of that interpretation. There's data beyond the medical chart and the lab results. And the data is made available to us through a number of indigenous practices that involves the use of these sacred medicines, always accompanied, of course, by the tobacco. And so the feedback I got in the community was, we got to experience a birth and not just a death. And so that is one of the clinical applications of the medicine. I've had obstetricians when I would use it for induction of labor in cases of mothers going beyond a certain gestational age for the baby. In one case, we brought together the whole society, set up the drum in her home, and started the singing and the drumming, and make her a bit of tea. She'd go into labor. And so those children who were born in this sacred way, they're really, really powerful. I've had the privilege of sitting in these ceremonies, and in the door comes a young man who 20 years ago was born with this medicine, coming in that teepee for the first time in his life. Sit down next to me, and through the night, I would tell him, you know, you came into this world with this medicine, and it would always reinforce something in them that is beyond description. It's all in the practice. These things are all in the practice. And it's impossible to intellectualize it, though we try. And I just want to give you that feeling of how the practical applications of this medicine for healing and the reinforcement of identity and culture, how significant it is to that process. So when we opened the birthing center at Six Nations, I had Grandma Lupe de la Cruz come to run a ceremony to open this birthing center among several other ceremonies that were held, and she went around and blessed our birthing center because she too is a midwife. And I loved how you said, Jeffrey, the interpretation of the word marakame means one who sees, because that's what this medicine allows, is the seeing. And I lost my mother when I was 11 years old. She was Mohawk from Ganawage, across the river from Montreal. And my father is a Mohawk from Akwesasne. He died when I was 9 months old as a fighter pilot in the Korean War. And so you can imagine the burden of grief as I grew. And so at 23, when I sat there with my nursing infant, I was able to see my mom and my dad and introduce them to my son. So these things are really deep and significant and can change your life. And so I offer that in humbleness, speaking to this question. To.
Those of us from an Anglo-Saxon descent, we lack these rituals. We lack this community. We don't have the coming of age ceremonies. Bar mitzvah is something that you have, but that's something a lot of us feel religiously shipwrecked. And so from my own experiences, I didn't benefit from having that cultural context and tradition to rely upon, and that's what I think why there's such an affection for First Peoples, is that they've been able to preserve under great duress these rituals that are carried through time. From my point of view, because I did a lot of solo tripping, after my first experience, then the subsequent experience that I had, took a lower dose this time. That was helpful. But it was still a 5-gram cubensis. That's a good dose. And the message that I would receive is, again, the feeling of oneness and the feeling of being, and realizing that all of nature is alive. Even the rocks and the dirt and everything around me was alive. And all these beings were calling out to me and saying with one voice, "Don't you see? Wake up. We are here. We are all one together. Come back." And the voices that I heard, they weren't auditory voices. They were just this gestalt of experiences of all this communication coming to me at once. And I was also terrified, but I felt this responsibility of now knowing that nature is all one, and all these voices were calling out to me to do something, to protect the biosphere, to protect the mother, that there's a continuum of ancestors and descendants of which we're one in a string. And it's so important that we, take the responsibility for our actions. And okay, that was a good experience. And then I'd wait a few months and I'd trip again. And I got the same message. And then I'd trip again, I got the same message. And then pretty soon I realized that this was my calling, and that we have a responsibility for our descendants as our ancestors had for us. And then I felt like, and my mother believes in this, that I was chosen, and that it is my time now to do the maximum of what I am capable of being able to protect the planet, the biosphere, and everything that represents. So this is where there's an emergence right now that I see within our society, the difference between being spiritual and being religious. There's an emergence of spiritual beings and consciousness that's sweeping, and we can't put it in a pigeonhole. We can't categorize it in a religious context. In fact, if you do call it a religion, then you're subscribing to certain doctrines and histories, and maybe it's an advantage to be religiously shipwrecked, because now you're on your own island of consciousness and you emerge into a new spiritual realm. So you're inventing new rituals. But I see now an emergence of science and spirituality. And as I mentioned earlier, that the most modern microbiologists and scientists and the shamans of First Peoples, when a person is diseased, the disease is caused by an unseen force. A microbiologist may call it a virus, and a shaman may call it a spirit. But in a sense, they're unified with the same modality, but using just different terms. So what's been really refreshing to me personally, with our discovery of agarikon having activity against Mycobacterium tuberculosis, TB, and yet for thousands of years, people's used agarikon to fight consumption. Well, we authenticated scientifically that which was known for thousands of years. So this is where modern medicine really needs to go to full circle to systems treatment. Not looking for magic bullets and the magic molecule, because when we isolate constituents away from the whole, they can be extremely powerful, but they lose the advantage of synergism and evolution. So from my experiences, and this has been my creative well that I've drank from, has been provided to me from my psychedelic experiences and having an open heart and an open mind. And I really am, I'm not a very smart person. I am not a very smart person. I didn't score very well on my SATs. I would always score, and then I'd erase the right answer and then I'd mark the other one, But, so I might have these innovations and ideas, but I just really don't feel ownership of them. I just can't faithfully and honestly tell you that I really come up with these ideas. They've been gifted to me. They've been given to me. And if I have found the missing link between bees and nature is mycelium, and bees have gone to rotted logs for millions of years because of immunological benefit, and I'm the first one to see this when we all grew up with Winnie the Pooh, and this was facing us right in our face. What does that say about our spiritual understanding of nature? And this is why I think First Peoples, in particular Native Americans of the North Americas, have really given us some wonderful baselines to reflect upon. The concept of 7 generations speaks so eloquently and purposely about what we need to take responsibility for, which is antithetical to the millisecond short trading by computers on Wall Street. It is something that we need to have a new ecological metric that measures the value of spiritualism, clean water, biodiversity, way of life. And we need to have a shakedown of our economic system. And I think these sacraments lead us to a new paradigm shift in consciousness. And so even though Ram Dass or Terence McKenna said, when you get the message, hang up the phone, I think you need to pick up the phone a lot more often.
I have a close to 30-year-old son who also follows the same spiritual path as me. He came into the teepee with me when he was about 8, and then traveled with me to Brazil, and it's been part of my life. And one of the things that really inspired me being in Brazil and also within the Native American church is the multi-generational, reality of grandparents there with their children, with their grandchildren, and participating in the rituals together, and the meaningful dimension of true family values and how that gets passed along within the ceremonies. And I mention this because my son went through a process a number of years back of applying to college. And he, among the different universities that he was looking into, one was Princeton University, and they had a really interesting application. And on the application it said, the person that you're going to spend the most time with over the course of your life is yourself. And so you should strive to make yourself the most interesting person possible. And I thought that was a really good way to approach, your education. And I mention that because a lot of the times the information and the guidance and the instructions that's come to me through the plants has come to me through my own thoughts. But there's a quality that's different. I know my own thoughts really well. I spend a lot of time hanging out with myself and thinking about things. And when a thought comes in that's really not mine, as Paul was describing, it's kind of like a gift of something that comes to you. You feel it. It has a different, it's much more organized than my thoughts. It's much more connected to the past, present, and future than my thoughts. It has a resonant quality of, like, it's very rare that if I have a thought on my own, I'll go, wow. but when a thought comes, like from a spiritually inspired thought, I'll even sit there and admire, this thought appeared inside of my own head. So I think that it's acknowledged that plants have intelligence. I think we all realize that. And if we consider the possibility that there's such a thing as sacred plants that are connected to a superior intelligence, and that when we receive communion or we ingest or we, in the Native American church, they speak of the peyote as the flesh of God. That's what you're digesting. It's the sense of communion, of like a sacrament, and within the Catholic Church, it's there's this process they describe of transmutation, which something becomes something holy. Within these traditional practices, the holiness is inherent. It doesn't have to go through a process to be holy. Its holiness is inherent, and so you take it into yourself, and as I was explaining earlier today, it makes you whole. And I've had some visions of things that would come to pass. I've had some things that were told to me, this will happen in your life, and I didn't say anything about it to anybody. I figured a healthy dose of cynicism or skepticism about your own proclivity to self-delusion or misdirection is really a healthy thing to approach, this path with. But I feel that along the way I would hold it and watch, and then these things would come to pass. And so I think over time you learn to discern what is the guidance, what is the teaching, what is the inspiration that comes to you from the spirit realm, which is you can really rely on, and what are just the machinations maybe of your own thought process that don't have the same direction, don't have the same quality.
So I thought one thing that might be interesting to unpack a little bit, since we're at Bioneers and we're thinking about the earth and eco-consciousness, is some of these plant plants seem to have the capacity to really, as Paul described, trigger this connection, even among urban people who spend very little time in the unmolested natural world. Some people are speculating, for instance, that ayahuasca is expanding from its boundaries in the Amazon as though it had a conscious intent to try to infuse eco-consciousness to people who need it throughout the world, so that we'll get to a higher consciousness, so that we'll be able to deal with the problems we're facing. How do you all feel about that? What do you think it is that triggers this type of eco-consciousness? It doesn't happen to everyone, but and do you think that is something that can be harnessed and that can grow into a larger movement, and what role these plants might play in that?
In terms of the Pejuta Wakan, the peyote, there was already a movement in the 60s of the unity caravans across North America and into Central and South America. And it's from those connections across the hemisphere that this medicine moved through the communities. And in my community of Akwesasne, those of us who hold a responsibility for this medicine know that in our oral history, this medicine came to our community about 100 years ago. But these beings, these spirit beings, if the people are not ready, because this medicine is not for everybody, the medicine will leave. And when we heard at the beginning, in the opening of Bioneers, beautiful presentations by Kenny and Nina, focusing on the power of the social intelligence. And so while we're talking about our own personal individual experiences with these sacred medicines, the fact is that the power of the connected knowers who participate in the ceremonial context, it takes a lot to put up a ceremony. From the men who go out in the woods to gather the logs for the fire in just a certain way, the way they have to carry their mind for the purpose of the meeting. Maybe you have a life in your hands. Someone is really sick. They have a terminal illness. And you have to keep your prayer focused on your intentions for that human being. And so from the gathering of the firewood and how it's cut, it has to be wood that's never touched the ground. It's not just laying on the ground. It has to be brought down, dried a certain way, split a certain way, stacked a certain way. The women, the water woman who brings the water in the morning, prepares the food for the noon meal. That's part of the culmination of the ceremony, and it has to be made in a specific way with prayer. The utmost attention is paid to every movement, and if you act in a certain way, it's noticed right away. And such beauty comes out of that social landscape that every ceremony you sit in, when your intention is to help someone else make it through a really rough time in their life. Maybe it's a 6-year-old child who was brought in there, suffered sexual abuse. And by morning, that little one is holding the staff and the instruments, having made his own song. These are really powerful pieces. So this question of the expansion of consciousness through the movement of these medicines, through human experience, has always been at play, has always been at work, and will continue in spite of any one of us. And so we think of it that way. We hold it in utmost respect, because we know that this grandfather medicine, he knows everything about us, even beyond words, what's in our hearts. And if you don't hold this medicine in a certain way, it will leave you. It will leave your people. So we have rejected the title of Native American church because of our history of colonization. And in our longhouse, we have a number of medicine societies, the different historic societies that you can read about, and Fenton and other anthropologists that still survive. And all of us who sit in that teepee society belong to some of these other medicine societies as well, and we bring all of that knowledge to the holding of this sacred power. And so it just happens. One thing we haven't discussed in terms of the perception and the acuity of this experience of engaging this medicine is the medicine of time itself, because you become acutely aware of time. And as a midwife, time is everything in a course of care. There's military time, obstetrical time, physiological time, but there's also sacred time. And so I wanted to mention that today, in the ways of the days of the Mayan calendar, is 7 Keme, the day of the ancestors. And we've spoken, each one of us, about the ancestors. And so even that is brought into the ceremonial space. In my own work over the last 40-some years, my theory is the connection between birth, dream, and ceremony, that all three, to have meaning and interpretation, have to be connected. And I know these things because in the practice of using this medicine to give birth to my own children, and using this medicine as an Aboriginal midwife, it moves through the people as needs arise. And it isn't just an individual experience. You are a group of connected knowers. And so out of that fireplace, it's like those spirits are in there, and they'll even throw a coal at you, like an exclamation point. Wake up and look at, you have to pay attention. You're in class. You're sitting in a university course in there in one night. And the knowledge that comes out of that is the purposes for healing. And the last thing I want to say is that in that first meeting I went in, I had the overwhelming feeling of the Creator's love, and what a gift that was. I always thought, I know what love is. But there was a moment where I experienced love that was beyond the ego. What I want out of love, I want him to be this way, or I want, all of that was removed. And the prayer becomes, when you truly love, you want the best for that other human being who was put into this earth for a purpose. Each one of you was born into a medicine of time, personality of a particular day. And there's a reason you're in this world, and you can tell from what my colleagues on this panel have described of their own life's experience, that these spirits will come after you. And you can say no, but you better watch out.
From this moment, I'm starting to trip. I feel this concept of super love and super consciousness, and when under the influence of these, the doors of perception, many people use different phrases, but I've always sensed like, oh, this is what it's all about. This is the super reality of which we only have a limited glimpse of. And when we come down, we're living in a limited reality right now. But under the influence of these sacraments, the whole world view, the universal view of consciousness, becomes quite apparent, and you realize you're not seeing everything that's out there because you're filtered because of survival and other factors we don't even know about. But here's an interesting little factoid, because I like facts. 22 primates eat mushrooms, and we being primates, we're number 23. Ascopolyporus is consumed by the Golgi, a monkey, a small primate in the Amazon basin. And if I have my memory correct, he eats, the monkeys eat nearly their body weight in mushrooms every 2 months. So it is their major source of protein. And you can look this up, Ascopolyporus Golgi, G-O-E-L-D-I. So our primates have had a history, and there are brothers and sisters, And so the stoned ape theory by Roland Fisher from 1962, repopularized by Terence McKenna. And Terence was a dear brother, and I feel like Terence is with us here right now, just supporting us in this conversation. But this, you know, and I can say this to Terence, to you right now, Terence, some of your ideas were bullshit. But I think, and many people have said this also, if 10% of Terence's ideas are true, they are so profound that it washes away everything else that we may not, you know, think that's possible. But Terence has repopularized the concept of the stoned ape theory, which basically states that as when we were forest primates and the savannas increased, then most primates eat grub, eat insect larvae, and as you track ungulates, you know, animals, and if you're tracking an animal, you look for footprints and you look for scat. And in the subtropics, the most predominant mushroom growing in manure, when you're tracking the ungulates across the prairie, is Psilocybe cubensis. So you're tracking these animals, you're trying to hunt, you find scat, this big fleshy mushroom, very predominant, comes out of the scat, the manure. You and your family and your clan consume this because you're hungry, and then you're catapulted into this amazing sensory inputting that's just far beyond anything that you had experienced before. And the theory is that it caused a split in the evolution of humans and led to present-day consciousness. I think that's a very, very credible theory. I really do. I think all the logic is in place, that you would have these encounters, and those of us who have these encounters know. By the way, this is a safe question for the audience. How many people here have not tripped on sacramental plants and mushrooms? Not. Okay. No matter what you've read, no matter what you've seen, you really have no idea. Fair enough, everybody else, right? Fair enough. So this is where I'm wondering, and you mentioned time, and we don't have time right now to go through different experiences, but you know, time is bent and through these experiences, and you know, you can see into the future. And this now is perhaps scientifically validated by the concept of the multiverse, that these sacraments allow you to change the present framework that's occurring simultaneously. All things happen all the time, all possibilities all at once. And you can shapeshift from one dimension into the other and then return. So this, I think, is perhaps the beginning of scientific support of the vision quest of seeing into the future and bending time, with allowing us to have a portal into the multiverse, and then it returns to it. Just a thought.
Yeah. So what I remember the question to be related to ecological consciousness perhaps being stimulated by the use of these plants. And I just came back from Ibiza, Spain, where there was the first international conference on ayahuasca that was held there. I was asked to speak about the issue of human rights and legal issues related to the use of these sacred plants, which were held as a guarded secret for centuries within the Amazon, and then today there were people from 60 different countries that were there, all of whom had had some experience either traveling to Peru or people that were bringing different ways of working with these plants into their communities. And it was really, I started to think a lot about it. And I think it's interesting in terms of anybody who's been to the Amazon forest, you can't help but be ecologically awakened entering into it because of the profound expression of life that's there. Jacques Cousteau even established a center in the city of Manaus, which is on the Amazon River. This is a person who spent his life studying the oceans, and he was so moved going into the Amazon that he set up an ecological center to bring people into the Amazon forest. And so I think that a lot of these instruments depend very much on who's utilizing them and what the objective is in utilizing them. The particular sacrament that we work with has to be prepared. There are 2 plants that are involved, and there's a ritual through which they're prepared. And the intention of how they're prepared and the way that they're prepared and what happens in the ceremony as they're being prepared affects very much the result of what happens after people, receive it. Clearly, I believe that there's the potential within all of these to, as I said earlier today, to connect us to the mind of nature and to start to understand things from the perspective of the universal consciousness, the universal mind. And I feel that that's why it's important to be talking about this, because we need an upgrade to our operating system. And I've not seen a better way than through these divine instruments.
I think we'll just keep the conversation going because we have 8 minutes instead of opening it to questions. Okay. By the way, we only have this has been so interesting and involving, about 6 minutes left, so I think we're just going to keep the conversation going, and this will be, sorry about that, but, okay. Sustainability of what? Oh, peyote. Oh, okay. Yes. So, all right. We'll make one exception, but I know, Gaji, you've spoken about this before. That peyote is almost an endangered species, and I think I'll open it up for a final, larger question, which is, I heard you say these medicines are not for everyone, and I think that we also have a social responsibility, in a sense, to express what our setting is important, but also perhaps who shouldn't be doing this, or under what conditions shouldn't they be doing it, because these are powerful tools. So both the question of the endangered species itself and who should or shouldn't be doing it, and then also what a context would be that would protect people who shouldn't be doing this from doing it.
That's a complicated question, and I don't think 6 minutes can do it any justice. But thank you for the thought. And it's true that those who make the pilgrimage to the peyote gardens, it's a challenge, and it's a big concern, because the landowners where the medicine grows have to, out of the kindness of their own compassion, make it available. And it's on our minds. The Lakota will say, the Navajo, they're eating all the medicine. So there's that natural, But it's like anything in creation. You have to, I really believe that if we don't use our medicines, we'll lose our medicines. As Robin Kimmerer said, they'll turn their faces away from us because they are spirits. And so that's the best I know how to answer. I don't know the bigger picture of, I work in environmental health, and so I have a great appreciation for what you're saying, but I really don't have the answer.
Well, I'll do this as quickly as I can. Dr. Alexander Smith was the father of American mycology, the most famous mycologist in North America, if not the world. Very conservative man. I got to know him. He published a monograph on the genus Psilocybe. And at the end of it, when he's about 75 years of age, he asked me, Paul, I want to trip on Psilocybes with you. I've never done them. I've written about them. I've published, 30 or 40 new species. I've read about it, but I want to do it. And he asked me. I was in Snowmass, Colorado. I thought about it the next day, went back to him, and I said, Alex, I will trip with mushrooms with you only if your wife Helen joins us. I said, Helen, will you join us? And she goes, no. And then I said, Alex, I don't want you to have this experience and create a division in your marriage, because your worldview could change so radically at the end of your life. Towards the end of your life, it's not responsible for me. Now, so I turned him down. My own father asked me near the end of his life to trip with me. And I said no, for the same reason. But another individual, Bill Webb of Big Sur, California, he became a father figure to me. We did trip together. And Bill gave me a message before he died. He was losing his hearing, his senses. He was had a psilocybe cubensis trip on the Big Sur. And he said, Paul, I have to tell you this. It's important you tell everybody about this experience. And I go, what is it, Bill? He says, well, I was tripping on cubensis. I had 5 grams. And I was on the deck, above the ocean, with the beautiful place at Big Sur. And I heard this noise. Click, 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 click. And it was mystifying to me. Now, he was wearing a hearing aid, and he goes, the worst thing about aging is you're losing your senses. I can't hear the ocean without my hearing aid. He took his hearing aid out when he was tripping, and he heard this click, 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 click. And he's there, and he's wondering what the heck this was. And it took him about 15 or 20 minutes. And he heard ants walking on the boards going past him.
My own current study of this, and I think it's an ongoing consideration, is it really depends on the strength of the community within which people are receiving this opportunity. That I've been in communities of within the practice we have. I've been in rituals where there have been 500-600 people involved in a ceremonial journey together. I was actually in a Native American church ceremony on the night that Reuben Snake was his memorial service, where there were 1,000 people eating peyote in a gymnasium together. But the strength of the community was what was really the factor that allowed all kinds of people to come in and find healing. And so I think that the most important factor is the strength of the communities that develop around this use that would allow us to be able to receive different kinds of people. There are people, for example, that come to us who I wish we could be able to receive, but we're not yet mature enough, or in the past haven't been as mature in a community. There was a young man in Hawaii who was addicted to methamphetamines, and he was seeking a community within which he could come and work with sacred medicines. And we didn't feel that we were able to where I live, but I checked with the community which has a much longer existence than we do in Brazil, and they would have been happy, to receive him and felt that they could easily work with something like that. So I think it depends on the systems of community and the structures of family that are in place to receive people.
Okay, thank you so much. I wish we had more time. This has been an incredible discussion, but thank you so much to our 3 presenters.